Hello. In the last discussion about Thomas Hobbes, I was trying to give you a little bit of background as far as what's going into his thinking, the forces that are at work there, the wars of the 17th century, and the way in which this lifts up the role of passion, but also of reason in our thinking. I also tried to point out the role of the scientific revolution of the 17th century, the thoughts of people like Sir Francis Bacon and Galileo and the whole development of the scientific methodology where you can observe things about the natural world, use reason to make deductions about it, and say determinative things about really the fundamental nature of the physical events around us. And I tried to mention something about Hobbes's work in translation of classical Greek thought, of Democritus, of Epicurus, of the atomists, and the way in which all this goes into shaping his thinking. The gist of this was that I was trying to get a few of the basic themes that go into his ideas about, well, the natural world generally, and then from that the life of individual human beings, what we call, I suppose, philosophical anthropology in the business, and also, more importantly, his political philosophy. And what it came down to was this. You got this theme with Hobbes, first of all, of a kind of atomism. You want to know what there is in the world? There is matter, and there is motion, and there is the mechanical forces that allow for the engagement of matter in the process of this thing called motion, and that is it. There's no God, there's no transcendental truth, there's no morality, there's nothing like that that's out there to speak of, at least no meaningful way for us to begin to speak about it for Hobbes. He does give a nod to the idea that perhaps there is a designing principle that you can call God, but there's no way in which we can ever come to it. So he is very much a naturalist, an atomist, a physicalist. Everything comes down to this material reality and the laws and principles that allow for a mechanical sense of motion with regard to it. Okay? That's important for understanding Hobbes as far as human beings and human thought goes. The other thing that comes from this is that Hobbes thought that human beings were driven, and I do mean driven because they're driven by this mechanical process, both by by what you might call this irrational, selfish, consumptive, destructive force. And it's interesting that he sees the irrational side as being destructive, right? It's the side that simply tries to grasp and attain and have for itself, and it almost anticipates the id in Freud, or these drives that you see in the thinking of someone like Nietzsche at work in us. This is part of where you get this idea for Hobbes that man is naturally in a state of war with one another. But you also, for Hobbes, have a recognition of this rational aspect that we have, this capacity for us to plan, to anticipate, to deduce, and to weigh multiple options. All of these are part of our structure. This is part of our makeup. And when it's combined with this element of selfishness, it allows for an interesting possibility. It's a possibility of society. What do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is that we have a possibility as human beings to cooperate with one another despite the fact that we are naturally and necessarily at war with one another for Hobbes. Here's what I mean. If I'm alone in nature, my natural state, I am a selfish, greedy bastard, just like everyone else. I have these desires, I have these wants, and I really have no sense of compassion or altruism or care for anybody else, except insofar as it benefits me in some way. But if I go through my rather brief and brutal existence like that, what I'm left with is a situation, according to Hobbes, where I'm not going to live long. And because I'm rational, I know this. I can anticipate this. I can see that I am not strong enough and I am not well endowed enough to be able to realize all that my will would like to realize. I just can't. And I know this. I can see this. I can deduce this. And I will because of the structure of my mind. So what am I going to do? Well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look around and I'm going to see other human beings. And I'm going to see other human beings who seem to have the same capacity as me, the same rational capacity as me, right? And I know they have it. Now, I don't like these people, and I know they don't like me. Again, part of the rationality. I know that they're selfish, greedy bastards as well. I know that they would stab me in the back if they could. But I also know that because they want to act in their own self-interest, what they're going to do is they're going to agree to work with me provided I'll watch their back. And how are they going to get me to watch their back? They're rational creatures. They're going to watch my back, right? Vice versa. Why is this important? It's important because this establishes the foundations, and I do mean the foundations, for the establishment of society for Hobbes. Essentially, in spite of the fact that we are selfish, greedy bastards, we are capable of establishing rational contracts with one another based entirely on self-interest. Rational contracts based entirely on self-interest, right? There's no altruism, there's no fellow feeling, there's no common communion that comes from this. And any of these things that do come, so commonality, sentimentality, affection for one another, Hobbes will, again, and he has a very good way of doing this, reduce all of this down to a kind of set of selfish drives that are at work inside of us. In spite of all of that, Hobbes will say that we can establish these relationships. We can establish these contracts. Now, this might be all there was to it if it wasn't for the fact that there was this other side, this selfish aspect, this selfish drive that was at work within this conversation and within this debate. And what happens within it is that for Hobbes, we are going to be overcome by that. It's not because we cease to be rational, exactly. Sometimes I suppose it is, and he does give some nod to that in his work, The Leviathan. But it's more because of the limits of rationality. Remember, while we're capable of exercising rationality, so making necessary deductions and inferences from axiomatic principles that we know, and while we're capable of observing different things and making deductions and inferences about them, our power to do that is limited. We are finite beings. We don't know the totality of all possibilities. We are still using reason to come through and think through the world, right? In other words, our thinking, our rational thinking, has a scope to it. It has a, right? There you go. There you go. It's the limit right there. And it can't see outside of that. And because it can't do that, there are times where it will seem to us rational to disregard the terms of our contract, to disregard the terms of our relationship, to disregard the interests that we have in supporting our fellow man. Because after all, remember, we don't care about him. We don't have a lot of affection towards him, or whatever affection we have towards him is basically selfish anyway, and our present needs are outweighed by that. There's no reason to keep this guy around, so what do? Cut him off. We abnegate the contract. We stop supporting. We stop helping him. And quite often, he leaves, he dies, he turns against us. Fine. Except it's not fine. Because what happens after that is that we're back in the situation we were in nature. Namely, we're on our own. And when we're on our own, we're not going to survive. So, what's the situation we got? The situation we got for Hobbes is this. We have the capacity to establish these relationships with one another, these contracts with one another. They are entirely rational, they are entirely selfish, and they form the foundations of society. And they can work pretty well up to a point. But because we are rational beings that can only see so far, and because we are selfish beings that are always looking out for number one, these contracts aren't going to stay established, and they'll disintegrate. What we need is something that preserves these contracts. And here's the interesting thing. We're rational enough to know even that. We're rational enough to know, in other words, the limits of our rationality. We're rational enough to know that if we don't have something other than a moment of self-interest maintaining the terms of this contract, the contract ain't going to stay there, and ultimately it's not going to do what we want it to do, namely preserve and protect us, right? It's got to do that. So, how are we going to do that? Well, this is where Hobbes gets rather radical, because what he does is he says, we in society elect, and that's his word, that's what's in the Leviathan. We elect a leader. The term is Leviathan. And this leader whom we elect, and it's not necessarily just one leader, it could be a body, it could be an oligarchy of some sort, a family, an organization even, is given the authority, handed over the authority to set down all terms and conditions for the contract. It becomes the arbiter of this contract. Now that sounds like, I don't know, sounds rather legalistic, and I suppose it is because it has to do with law. But what's radical about it isn't the legalism of it. What's radical about it is the extent of it. Because you see, remember, we don't have, for Hobbes, any sort of natural morality. We don't have any sort of natural appeal to some transcendental truth that's out there. All we have is this basic selfish condition that each of us as individuals has, looking out for our own private interests as best we can. When we look at what we consider to be moral life or moral truth, you know what we're going to look at? You know what we're going to see? We're going to see something that looks good for us individually, and that's it. And that, as I was saying, is not going to preserve society. The Leviathan knows this, so Leviathan lays down laws about arbitrating contracts, about morality, right and wrong, about religion, and anything, and let me just underscore this, anything that the Leviathan lays down is legitimate. Indeed, the assertion of the Leviathan legitimates itself. It legitimates itself. It makes its own conditions for rightness and wrongness because it has the power to do it. And it has to, right? I mean, this is, if it wasn't capable of doing that, the contracts that make up society, and that is what makes up society, would disintegrate, and there'd be no basis for anything. You got a situation, in other words, where the power of the Leviathan to lay down the legislation, the arbitration, and in a lot of ways just the correctness of these contracts is absolute, because if it wasn't there, there wouldn't be anything else to lay them down, and the contracts would essentially rip themselves apart. But this means that there's almost nothing that the Leviathan can do that's wrong. Everything that the Leviathan lays down becomes law, and even things that seem just blatantly illegal, even blatantly immoral, are legitimate within this, provided they come from the Leviathan and provided they do one thing. And this is sort of a negative thing, that they don't break the peace. If the Leviathan acts in such a fashion as to break the peace, they essentially undercut their own legitimacy. They undercut their own capacity to assert authority about law. And as a result, they have no legitimacy. They've destroyed their own legitimacy. So, if you have a Leviathan who makes laws that are so oppressive, so cruel, so humiliating, so exploitative, that they incite revolt, well, that Leviathan becomes illegitimate. But it's not because it was so cruel, mean, exploitative, or anything else. It's because it incited revolt, and that's it. And if it doesn't incite that revolt, if it ensures the authority of the Leviathan, if it instills, say, a sense of fear or glory for the Leviathan, wow, that's not just okay, it's entirely legitimate. It even can be celebratory, right? And this is what you have, I guess. A way in which I think about the Leviathan is the fulcrum of political power. The Leviathan is the position that allows for the possibility of us exerting and cooperating with our political capital that each and every one of us bring in our own selfish way to one another, to be able to realize all these different ideas, all these different possibilities, all these different strategies for survival. I guess the last thing I'd say about this is a lot of people, certainly when I've taught this over the years, have said, well, this sounds like a stone cold bummer. That's one way I've heard it put before. They'll say, this is not a decent way to run a government. There's no sense of human rights. And yeah, maybe there's a contract in which everyone's agreeing, but you're talking about something that has absolutely no appeal to human decency and goodness. And human beings, if they don't have this decency and goodness, then what are they? How are they going to survive? How are they going to persist? Well, I'll tell you what. In a way, and this goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning of the other lecture, I think that this is actually kind of positive, and I'll tell you why. Hobbes, there's no doubt Hobbes has a very dark view of human nature. There is no deep sense of morality. There is, other than selfishness, there is no sense of immortality of soul or theology. There is no sense in which we are naturally disposed to get along with one another. None of that's there. But there is this way that we do have, in spite of all of this rational capacity to cooperate and get along, and not just cooperate, but sustain that cooperation and adjust and change and move and organize as the events of our society and our world shift and change around us. And that's actually kind of a positive thing. You know, that's something where, in spite of the fact that we're all selfish sons of bitches, or daughters of bitches, as the case may be, play on the phrase, we still can make it. Human beings may have hearts of darkness, as it were, and it may be a very simple physical thing, but in spite of that, we can still find a way to get along and even to flourish. And this is what Hobbes and the idea of the Leviathan is all about.